Welcome everyone to today's Jewish Gen Talk. We are glad you're here. As we always do, please leave a note in the chat. Let us know where you're logging in from. And we'll start in a couple of minutes, right on time. But in the meantime, let us know where you're from. We're glad that you're here. We have people from right here in New York City, Jerusalem, Minneapolis, Minnesota, the United Kingdom, Louisiana. We have Vicky Fox. It's coming by quickly. Portland, Oregon. Judy from Florida, Judy Katz. Carrie Zeidman, David Ellis. We got Cone, Joel Kessler in Philadelphia. Cleveland Heights we have. Newton, Massachusetts. Hamburg, Germany. Welcome. Judy Kopp from Arizona. We have Tucson, Arizona. Ann Arbor. Los Angeles, right near you, Marion. We have Phoenix, Cleveland, Denver, people from all over the country today. People from London, David Woods, welcome. Seattle, Washington. Ram Noham in Israel. Arlene Bear is on the call. Welcome, Arlene, co-director of the Latvia Research Division. For those of you who are just logging in, we're about a minute away from getting started. Let us know where you're logging in from. You could leave a note in the chat. We're glad you're with us. We'll start in a minute. We have people from New Mexico, right here in New York City, Haifa in Israel, Toronto, South Carolina, somebody else in Israel, New Hampshire, St. Louis, Yonkers in New York, the Netherlands, welcome. Paul Shafitz is on, also co-director of the Latvia Research Division, so everybody is represented. There was somebody from Poland, welcome. And for those of you logging in, you can let us know where you are from in the chat. And it is right at the 2 o'clock mark here in New York City. So we are going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Avram Grohl, and I'm privileged to serve as the executive director of JewishGen. For those of you who are new to the Jewish Gen Talks or new to JewishGen, we are part of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, which is based in Lower Manhattan in New York City. And we are an organization devoted to preserving our Jewish family history and heritage for future generations. And we do this by offering a free website whereby you can search millions of records, you can connect with thousands of researchers, and you can learn more about the communities in which your families came from and what their lives were like. Today's talk is part of our ongoing Jewish Gen Talks series of educational webinars, and we're going to focus on what you can do when traditional genealogical records are not available. Our speaker today is Marion Werle, who's well known in the Jewish Gen community as the co-director of the JewishGen Latvia Research Division. And on this webinar, we're joined, one of the participants is Arlene Beer and Paul Shafitz, who are co-directors along with Marion. Marion is also a member of our education team. She teaches a writing class, which is very well received. Marion has been devoted and has devoted her time to the broader Jewish genealogical community as well. Outside of JewishGen, she's served on a number of boards for Jewish Genealogical Societies in the Los Angeles area. In her professional life, she was an IT professional. She has multiple master's degrees in European history and library science. She's also a certified genealogist. She has a certificate in genealogical research. She's completed a ProGen course, and she is a wonderful resource to the many, many people who reach out to her. So we were very, very glad that she's with us today. Just a few notes, as we always mention, the session is being recorded and you can view it afterwards on our YouTube channel. Marion has graciously provided a handout which was distributed in the emails that you've received over the last couple of hours. Once Marion starts talking, I will also post a link in the chat, and I'll also send out in the follow-up email, you'll have the handout as well. If you'd like to ask questions, we are glad to take them. We'll try to get to them at the end. Please post them in the Q&A on the bottom of your screens as we go along. You're welcome to use the chat. It's a wonderful way to connect with each other, to clarify anything that comes up. But please post the questions in the Q&A. That's where we're going to be looking at the end of the program. I'm going to enable the transcription. So as Marion's talking, you'll see that at the bottom of your screens. And finally, if you are new to JewishGen, or even if you're not new, but you haven't done it yet, please sign up for the discussion group and the Jewish Genealogy portal on Facebook. Both of those platforms are fantastic opportunities to connect with thousands of other researchers around the world. You can ask questions, you can post advice, you can ask advice, you can share advice, you can share success stories, you can learn about what other people are doing. You could stay informed of programs like this JewishGen Talk. So please sign up. There are amazing resources that you can find only on JewishGen. You can access the discussion group by clicking connect on the homepage, and you can search for the Jewish Genealogy portal on Facebook. And we'll also include those links in the follow-up email. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Marion. So Marion, I'm going to turn off my screen, but I'll be here in case you need anything. And then at the end, we'll go through the questions. And Marion, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Avrami. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I see it perfectly.
Okay, just a minor correction. I wish I could say I am a certified genealogist. In fact, I have a certificate from Boston University, and I would be remiss, I am not BCG certified, and I would be remiss if I did not state that. However, okay. So
you are a wonderful genealogist.
I have a certificate in wonderful. Okay, this talk was inspired by a project that I worked on a few years ago. And I was tracing a family who lived in San Francisco from the 1850s to 1900. And I had this whole plan to build my project around census records and around vital records. And since I really hadn't done any work with San Francisco before, I started to do some background research. And I discovered that California didn't require state registration of vital records until 1905. And prior to that, it was the responsibility of either the city or the county. But then it hit me that I had a much bigger problem. And that was the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco and the subsequent fires that destroyed the city. And the vital records were either at the bottom of a pile of rubble or burned up. But surprisingly, I was still able to put together a good profile of the family using alternate records. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So why might some records be unavailable? We already talked about disasters. So you've got fires and earthquakes, but then there's also rain, floods, and so forth. And then there's the man-made disaster, wars. Now, we do research in countries that have pretty much been ravaged by 2 world wars, not to mention various revolutions and civil wars as well. So when preservation of life becomes a priority, the records aren't. The other thing is that plain old deterioration. We now know that in order to preserve archival records, you need to keep constant humidity and constant temperature, and we have the technology to do that, but that didn't exist in the old days. So, okay, so that didn't exist in the old days. And the other thing is that records may not have existed in the first place. So for instance, we talked about vital records on a state or national level weren't required by many jurisdictions until a lot later. And, you know, overseas, it was completely different as well. So in fact, we may be looking for an 1810 birth record from Lithuania, and it may not even exist. A more recent wrinkle is privacy laws. And so even though records exist, every jurisdiction has its own privacy laws that will restrict access. And then finally, I just wanted to mention transcription errors. If you're depending on an index to help you find records, transcription errors can almost make them inaccessible, and sometimes you're forced to actually go through a record set manually. So first of all, before you determine that a source is missing, Be sure you're being flexible in your searching. You need to cast a wide net. Don't just search in one online search with one online company, not with, with whether it's JewishGen or whether it's Family Search or whether it's MyHeritage or Ancestry. Cast a wide net, and then be aware that not everything is online and that you may need to write away or visit an archives or write away to an archives. The other thing, and we're going to see an example of this in a few minutes, is that the event you're looking for may not have taken place where you thought it did. So you need to check nearby jurisdictions. We get really focused on finding, where did your ancestors originate and so forth, but there was a lot of business and so forth that was transacted outside where they lived. People got married in different places. So you need to make sure that you look at the map and sort of see where would this event have taken place. So even if you can find the source you're looking for, some of these alternate sources can still add to your research. And even if those better sources are available, they can still enhance your research. And as we'll see in a minute, they can even lead to information that assists you in finding something that you couldn't find before that you thought was missing. So what's an alternate source? An alternate source is a so-called lower quality source that is a substitute that you use as a substitute when one or more original records from a primary informant don't exist to answer your research question. That's quite a mouthful, so let's do a brief overview of genealogy methodology terms. So first of all, the genealogical proof standard specifies that you perform a reasonably exhaustive search emphasizing original records. The emphasis is on the quality of the records, not the quantity of the records. So for instance, you don't want to find 10 family trees when all of those family trees have been copied from one family tree and that information may have been incorrect in the first place. You want to be looking at original records. So their sources and records are sort of interchangeable in this terminology. So original records are just what you think they are. It's an original document. It could be the ledger where the birth ledger, the birth register, an original letter that you have from an ancestor, a photo, the original copy of your grandparents' ketubah, an original a gravestone, something that's in its original form. The next category is derivative, and that is any source that derives from an original source. So it's various types of copies, but these days, if you have a good digital copy, most genealogists would consider a good digital copy of a source almost as good as an original. Then you have translations, you have transcriptions, you have abstracts and extracts. You have indexes which are in essence an extract, and then various kinds of database records. And sometimes if you get a certified vital record, like if you get a certified birth certificate, that's not going to be a copy of the original. It's just going to be it's going to be an official copy that you can use for legal purposes, but it doesn't have all the information that was in the original, depending on the jurisdiction. And then there are authored works or authored sources, and those include things like local histories, a genealogy report, obituaries, articles, biographies, research reports, and even Yisker books. And there's usually some kind of analysis or conclusions that are reached by the author, and then, but the reliability of that source is going to vary. Now, notice I didn't say primary and secondary sources, because in genealogy we refer to primary and secondary as the types of information. So a primary informant is somebody who saw the event happen, or they participated in the event and they recorded it at the time. It's usually, but not always, accurate. So it would be like the person who was performing a marriage, or the midwife who delivered a baby, or and even a father who goes to register the birth. He may not have been present in the room where the birth took place, but he he was there when it happened, so he can report on it accurately. A secondary information or a secondary informant relies on secondhand knowledge. And just because it's secondary doesn't mean it's wrong. Now, we're secondary informants when it comes to our birth certificates or to our birth information. We saw it on a birth certificate, but and we were technically, I suppose, an eyewitness to the birth, but we were not conscious of it and we didn't report it. So we are we are reporting our births from secondhand knowledge. And just because it's secondhand doesn't mean it's wrong. It just, and it's also typically well after the fact. There is also unknown or indeterminate information, and where the source of the information isn't known. So American census records prior to 1940, you don't know if they talked to the head of household, somebody who lived there, one of the kids, the neighbor across the hall, or who. Some Yisker books may be written by a committee. You're not really sure who it was. And again, just because it's unknown, you don't know who wrote it, doesn't mean it's wrong. And then there are a lot of sources that have combination of information types. So for instance, on a death certificate, you've got the doctor who certifies the death, but then you've got an informant who may be a child or a grandchild or a spouse or somebody who may or may not know the additional information that's reported on that death certificate. So for instance, if they may not know the mother's maiden name, but so that is in fact secondary information. And derivative sources, I wanted to mention also that in derivative sources, JewishGen sources are primarily derivative, although a lot of them have links to copies of the original. However, a derivative source can still have primary information if it's based on a record that was created by a primary informant. So if you've got a birth certificate, if you've got a birth certificate that's based on a primary informant, then that is still, the derivative source will still be primary. Okay, and then the last concept is evidence. There's actually three, but I'm only going to talk about two. There's direct evidence, where a single piece of evidence answers a research question. So if you want to know, for instance, how old somebody is, you can find that out on a census record, by their birth certificate, or in a marriage record, but each of those three sources is not going to be equally reliable, but they are all direct evidence of that person's age. Indirect evidence, which is what sometimes we can use if records aren't available, requires two or more pieces of evidence to answer a question. So for instance, if you see in one census, you see a woman living with her husband and her family, then in the next census, she shows up as a widow, and she's living maybe with a few more family members, but the husband's not there. You can probably infer through indirect evidence that the husband died sometime between when the last census was taken and the current census was taken. So if direct evidence isn't available, then you can use indirect evidence to answer research questions. So, by looking at that census example, then you would know, in the absence of the actual death certificate, you'd know, first of all, to look within that time frame. But if you couldn't find it, you would have an approximate time frame that event took place. So when you can't find the records, you're going to substitute so-called lower quality records or alternate sources, which are derivative or authored works with secondary or unknown informants, for missing original sources with primary information. And now we're going to see some examples. So let's talk about death records. Obituaries are really valuable because they can provide a death date. Now, that's not always an explicit date. Sometimes it's implied. If you read in the obituary, the obituary typically has a date on it, and it'll say, last Tuesday or 2 days ago or yesterday. And sometimes it does give the date. For women, it often gives the maiden name, or sometimes if it lists survivors and male siblings, then you can infer the maiden name from the obituary if you don't already know it. It'll give their age, their residence, other family members, and some of those are going to be living, and also the places where the family members live. And so sometimes, it's a good way to trace living family members. So you've got, and then occupations, interests, and other information. Now, the informant is unknown, but it's likely a family member. And I have seen many obituaries where sometimes the facts and the spelling are misinterpreted by the person who actually published the obituary. So just be aware that that's the case. But on the other hand, obituaries can provide really valuable clues. Now, where do you find them? Newspapers, funeral homes, cemeteries, obituary aggregators such as legacy.com, and then military memorial websites. Now, obituaries are slightly different than funeral announcements or death notices, which also are in newspapers or on cemetery websites. Those are more abbreviated and they generally don't contain the same level of detail as a full obituary. They'll list the person's name, the time of the service, possibly a few survivors, and that's pretty much about it. Then we have cemetery websites and gravestones, and there are the large websites like Find a Grave and Billion Graves, Jober, and then JewishData.com, which also has some photos of headstones. The information that you're going to get is the death date and year, the birth date and year, and we will see an example of that because the reliability is iffy. Your name, the deceased's name, and then the marital and parental status, which is implied. So for instance, if it says beloved wife and mother, you know the person was married and had children. Occasionally it'll have an occupation. And then older Jewish headstones provide the Hebrew name, the death date, the Jewish death date, and then the father's name, and then the so-called tribe, whether they're Kohen or Levi, or, and then also for Jober, you're gonna find the burial society. Be aware that headstones and gravestones are notoriously subject to error, especially for birth information, and we're going to see an example of that in a minute. I wanted to add that smaller cemeteries may have their own websites that show photos of headstones. I've noticed a lot of these in Canada, to find that, you just Google a cemetery name and see what you can find. Now, individual cemeteries may have their own databases that are going to list the name, age, death or burial date, and plot location, and burial society name. And there's on your handout, there's a link to a site that's on JewishGen that lists a lot of New York cemeteries that have cemetery websites that are like this. Now, funeral homes can also provide the background information because they're really primary informants when it comes to the burial. And they have their own records. So they're usually really, really cooperative. You can email them or call them. I only found, I called one once that I had somebody who got up on the wrong side of the bed and was really snippy with me, but generally they're really helpful. And they can clarify things like death versus burial dates. Like sometimes on Jober, you'll see death date, maybe burial date, but the funeral home can typically clarify that. And sometimes they can provide yahrzeit information. And even if I called a cemetery in Montreal that was, or a funeral home in Montreal that was not quite, they have very strict privacy laws and they weren't really that forthcoming, but I said, oh, by the way, could you give me the yahrzeit information? And they were very forthcoming. So it just depends how you ask the question. And they can also provide information on who provided the funeral arrangements. And sometimes that's really, really helpful. And then they can, if there's information that's questionable in an obituary, if they have the correct information, they can supply it. And then you can also contact the Jober compilers and transcribers, and hopefully Nolan won't mind that I'm giving his name out here, but in the example I'm going to show, I actually got I was able to get in touch with the people who transcribed the cemetery to get some further information. So this is an example of a cousin of my grandfather. Her name was Paula Ethel Garson, and she was buried in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia in Canada. Now, this is a rather peculiar headstone. It's got both crosses and a Star of David on it, and I have absolutely no explanation for that. But it shows here that Paula Ethel was born on August 21st, 1934, and she died in 2002. She was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Garson, and she was an artist. Now, I saw this 1934 date, and I said, wait a minute, that can't be, because I had seen her name listed in the 1921 Census of Canada. There were 2 children enumerated with the family. There was Ethel Pauline, who was age 4, and Gertrude, who was age 3. Now, Gertrude's headstone shows her birth date as May 27th, I can't even see it because this is in the middle of, okay, I was going to say these little heads are on top of here from Zoom. Okay, it shows her birth date as May 27th, 1918. And if she was born in 1918 and she was older, she was younger than Paula or Ethel Pauline, then clearly there's a problem there because she was not born in 1934. Now, at the time I was doing this research, birth records weren't available in Nova Scotia because of the privacy laws, and they were unavailable until under 100 years after the birth was registered, and this was a couple of years. I still had a couple of years to go. So I was able to get in touch with the Jober transcriber, and he seemed to remember that the sisters were around the same age. Now, don't forget, Yarmouth is a very small community, but he seemed to remember they were around the same age. And the funeral home gave me the information that the informant was Gertrude, the sister, and Gertrude was in her 80s at the time, so she should have known the information, but right there may be a discrepancy. So this is a case where my instinct would have been to go with the 1921 census, and as you can tell, I would have been right. So this is a copy of the birth certificate, and it's difficult to read, but it shows that Pauline Ethel Garson was born on August 20th, not the 21st, in 1916. So she was not in fact born in 1934. Now, what are the lessons we can learn from this? The census is based on an unknown informant. That's true, but it was taken closer to the time of Pauline's birth, closer to the event. The name variation, Ethel Pauline, is consistent with other name variations that I was able to track through her life. She went back and forth across the border, and she seemed to vary, what she called herself, but the Ethel and the Paula and the Pauline or Pauline were all parts of her name. And the census showed that the two sisters were close in age, and they were both alive in 1921, so that the 1934 birth date was unlikely. Now, the headstone was ordered by her aging sister, and you would have assumed that she would have known her sister's age, but we don't know what her cognitive state was at the time. The error is consistent with what the funeral home record said, but in this case, the census turned out to be the more reliable source. In other cases, you've got gravestones that are commissioned by family members, particularly grandchildren, who may not know the exact birth date of old relatives, and they may not know their Hebrew name either, especially if they were born in the old country. The grandchildren are much more separated from that. So the bottom line is to take information on the gravestone with a grain of salt. Use it as a clue, but take it with a grain of salt. Now, other sources of death information are wills and probate. Now, be aware that not everybody had a will. Now, my relatives were almost all poor. They didn't own anything, and so they mostly didn't have wills. Also, be aware that a probate date can be well after the death date. Now, will summaries are often published as legal notices in historical newspapers at the time that they're probated, but be careful. We'll see an example where what you read doesn't always tell the whole story. If you're looking for wills and probate collections, check the Ancestry card catalog for the jurisdiction you're looking at, and they have a very big indexed collection. And the Family Search catalog has some unindexed collections for some places. Also, Ancestry has the UK Probate Calendar, which summarizes probate filings in the UK. If you are fortunate enough to get a copy of a will, it can provide a lot of information about the deceased's financial status, who their family members were, and then also what the priorities of the deceased were in terms of who they left money to. So this is an example of a summary of a will in a newspaper. And I call your attention to the last sentence here, where it says, the son Samuel is given $2,250, the son Ernest $3,000, daughter Ella $2,250, and son Thomas $25. And you just, at first glance, you go, whoa, what did Thomas do to have this falling out with his father? And as it turns out, the actual will was available, a copy of it was available on Family Search, and it paints a much different picture. So he said, I give and bequeath to my son, Thomas Adamson, the son of $25, in addition to what he has already received. And knowing Thomas's background, he ran a grocery store with his brother for a while, and it's obvious it seems pretty, it's probable from this that the father gave him some money to start up that grocery store. Now we're going to talk about historical newspapers, which are one of my favorite sources. The obvious thing that historical newspapers have are birth, marriage, and death information on births, marriages, and deaths. But there's a lot of background and social information, and then just life story information that gives texture, especially if you're writing a family history. Early articles don't have a byline, and so you don't really know who the informant is in a lot of cases. Sometimes, depending on the paper you're looking at, there's sort of a yellow journalism. Some of the things may be a little bit sensationalized. There was one family that I was researching where there had been a supposed accidental shooting where the son accidentally shot himself. And it was presented, there was a coroner's inquest, they presented it as an accident, but some of the newspapers said, well, it was really a suicide and he was really depressed. So, but most of them are pretty straightforward. But even though you don't know the source of the information, the articles can provide this kind of information. You do need to verify it, but it can also give clues about family members and where to look for further information. So we talked about vital records, birth, marriage, and death announcements. Legal announcements include probate, but also real estate trades. And they may lead to information. For instance, if somebody bought, if there was a real estate trade within a certain jurisdiction, that there may be real estate records that will give further information as far as where they bought the information, where they bought the property from, and so forth. Then there's other local news. So there's things about accidents and robberies. Society pages have vacation news and news about parties and social events, changes of residence, military postings. So there's all sorts of information that can be really useful. There are also specific Jewish newspaper collections. My family is originally from Canada, so there and a lot of them, historically they lived there. There were a fairly wide family who lived there. The Canadian Jewish Review is a good newspaper for that I found really useful. The Chicago Sentinel is another paper. The Jewish Chronicle, which is from the UK, that is available on MyHeritage, and then they also have their own website as well. And the Detroit Jewish News, those are just some of the Jewish newspapers that are available. There are also overseas newspapers, and being that I've done a fair amount of Latvian research, there's a website from the National Library of Latvia called Periodica that has OCR digitized newspapers in the interwar period. Now, where do you find historical newspapers? Ancestry, newspapers.com, which is another paid site, and Ancestry, because they own newspapers.com, has done a lot of indexing for birth, marriage, and death announcements. So they've actually extracted the names, and that'll turn up on an Ancestry search. Chronicling America is a free site run by the Library of Congress. MyHeritage has really beefed up their newspaper collection. They had pretty good state collections, and now they seem to overlap a lot of newspaper collections that are in common with newspapers.com. ProQuest historical newspapers, which you may have seen at access to at an IAJGS conference, is a service that's available for libraries. It's quite expensive, but your local public library may have access to historical newspapers in your immediate area. So in my case, through my Los Angeles Public Library card, from home, I can get access to historical editions, digitized editions of the Los Angeles Times and also the San Francisco Chronicle. Historical societies may also have, and smaller libraries may also have microfilm copies that have not yet been digitized. And sometimes that, by writing to them, that you may be able to find information that you won't be able to find elsewhere. Universities and then a lot of state archives have also done digitizing of newspapers. I also wanted to call your attention, which is also on your handout, to the National Library of Israel, which has a collection of digitized newspapers called Historical Jewish Press. So that includes the Chicago Sentinel, which is also on the Illinois State Archives, and then also the B'nai B'rith Messenger, which was an old Los Angeles newspaper, but there are a lot of them on their website. This is an example of a wedding announcement, and there are a couple of things to note here. This was actually a friend of mine. I was helping her find some information. Sarah Rosenfeld was her, or Sarah Wolf was her grandmother. And she had been married before. Her maiden name was Lefstein, and she had been married before. Her husband had died, and she remarried someone named Lewis Wolf. And I knew that she was from Rock Island. However, the marriage took place at the home of Rabbi Morris Scudder, who happens to be my grandmother's brother, who was a shochet who worked with one of the major slaughterhouses in Davenport, Iowa, but he was also a lay rabbi and performed marriages and funerals and so forth. But anyway, he officiated at the service, and it was held at his home. Now, the important takeaway here is that the marriage did not take place in Rock Island, which is where they lived. Now, if you look at a map, Rock Island is right across the river from Davenport, Iowa. And it turned out that there was, in fact, that Family Search has filmed Iowa marriage records, and the collection was indexed, and the marriage certificate was available on Family Search. But I wouldn't have known about that had it not been for this wedding announcement. This is another piece of information that you might not get elsewhere. There was a major fire in one of the military archives, I believe in St. Louis, a number of years ago. And this is my husband's uncle. This is his aunt, was his Aunt Jane Ann, and this tells about his uncle's military posting. It tells that he was with the U.S. Labor Supervision Center at Michigan near Stuttgart for 13 months. And that's a piece of information that we wouldn't have known otherwise, but it's just, this was in the local El Paso newspaper. This is a wedding announcement from 1939. This was from that Latvian newspaper website that I talked about, and it was in a section called What's New in Daugavpils. And it shows that this was a civil registry that shows that Israel Maimond, whose mother was Ita Minsk, who was my great-grandmother's sister, married someone named Lubov Ziv, and they both were from Vinsk. So that's information that we didn't have either. I wanted to talk about Holocaust resources. This is just a very high overview, but this is a way to get information about lives of relatives who were murdered in the Shoah, as well as those who survived or fled. We all know about Yad Vashem, which has its Shoah names database, its archives and photos. Pages of testimony can be really helpful and sort of a substitute for vital records, especially if they were filled out by family members who left the old country, who left their country of origin in before the war, sometime like in the 20s or 30s. They would have firsthand knowledge of their parents, and so they would be more reliable than than a page of testimony that was filled out by a committee that didn't really know them. Or somebody who filled it out, just to memorialize them, who really, who just was based on family story. But there's a lot of really good information about family members there. And Yad Vashem, of course, has lists that are from a lot of different places, but they also include the Russian lists from the Russian Extraordinary Commission lists. There are also country-specific resources. The one that I'm most familiar with, and I really wish they existed for more countries, is the Jews of Latvia Names and Fates. This website was recently redone, and I'll show you the kind of information you can get on people who who lived ancestors who lived in Latvia between the two world wars or prior to the war. There are also Yizkor books and testimonies. And then there are memorial websites like Kahila Links, and then there are external shtetl projects as well. A few that I'm familiar with, there's one called Shtetl Skud, which was done as a project that somebody from University of British Columbia did. Skud is Skuders, Lithuania, where my paternal grandparents are from. The Mosidis Shtetl project, which was done by a cousin of mine, a second cousin of mine. Mosidis is a town in Lithuania that's very close to Skuders. And then a new one that was just posted on JewishGen the other day called The Holocaust in Kuldiga, Latvia, Microhistory, where someone put up a memorial site. Then, of course, there's the JewishGen Holocaust database, which has access to a number of different external sites and has a lot of really good information. And then I also wanted to mention the Arelson archives. Now, this is the home screen of the new website for the Jews of Latvia Names and Fates project, which was set up to memorialize the approximately 70,000 Jews who were murdered in the Shoah of a community of over 90,000. But the other thing is that it also includes people who survived the war. This Isaac Maimon is somebody who we saw the marriage certificate, the marriage announcement for Israel Maimon. Well, Isaac Maimon was his brother, and again, it shows that both his parents' names, including Ita Minsk, my great grandmother's sister. It shows that he was born in Vinsk. During the war, he lived in, or before the war, he lived in Riga, and he was single. Now, notice what his fate during the war. Sometimes this will say ghetto. Sometimes it's blank if they don't know what happened to them. But in this case, it shows that he fled. He was in the Red Army, and he survived. Now, the great thing about this website is it gives sources. So house registers, birth records, and so on and so forth. And you can use, if you cite this this entry on this website and write to the archivists and the Latvian State Historical Archives, they can find you these documents. There's also here, it's submitted by Mark Maimond. If you see a submitted by, that means that a surviving relative has given information about this person. And just by this reference, I was able to find a cousin that I did not know existed. Yizkor books are authored works. Some of them are published by committees, others are personal testimonies. Your handout gives you a few places where you can find copies of Yizkor books. There are academic and other libraries. I first found Yizkor books years ago at UCLA Research Library. New York Public Library now has a digitized collection, as does the Yiddish Book Center. The JewishGen Yizkor Book Project has translations of Yizkor books that are really helpful. Now, Yizkor books vary a lot in the content and format. Typically, there's going to be a history of a town. It'll talk about the Jewish institutions, some of the famous personalities, what happened during the Shoah, and then it'll have lists of victims and survivors. Now, I put a question here, which, how well did the authors know your family? And the reason I put that here is that a cousin of mine, way back when I started my research, well over 20 years ago, had gone to YIVO, and she got a copy of a Yizkor book from where our family was from. And she was fluent in Hebrew. She had grown up in Israel, and she looked at it and she said, my family's not here. Her family had made Aliyah, and then they came to the United States. And she goes, my family's not here, but yet other family members were listed. So you can't always assume that the committee that put together the Yizkor book knew what happened to your family. And sometimes there are errors. I mean, I've seen that a family may be not in there altogether, or they may attribute children to remarried spouses, or they may confuse siblings. So, it's a great way to get an idea of what happened to your town, but again, they may or may not have known your family. Now, these are copies that I had made from an original Yizkor book that I actually had a physical book in my hand from years ago. That there are also copies on JewishGen as well. These were memorial plaques that were from the ProGen Yizkor book. Now, ProGen is a town that's that is in what's now Belarus, and Rezel Zeldis, whose maiden name was Molchatsky, was very active in the ProGen organization in New York. And what's interesting about this is it not only has information about her family, about those who died in the Shoah, but it has information on other family members. Now, Joseph Kalman Molchatsky is related to my family because we knew that Rezel was a cousin. I believe that he was probably my great-grandfather's first cousin, because my great-grandfather was Yosef Yitzchak Molchatsky. Oh, excuse me, Yosef Yehoshua Molchatsky, but they were clearly named after the same person. But we see here, in addition to her father who died in the ghetto, her mother's name was Gittel, and she died in 1938. I had no idea she existed. And there was also a sister Malka who died in 1932 in Pruzhny. And then this memorial plaque also lists some other people who died some other family members who died in the Shoah. So you never know what you're going to find in a Yizkor book, but this was sort of surprising because it had people that, these were memorial plaques for people who both died in the Shoah and didn't. Now, on a totally different tack, I want to talk about city directories. And city directories are incredibly useful. They and they're especially helpful between censuses, or if you can't find your ancestor in the census. I don't know about you, but a lot of my family members seem to be absent, completely absent when it comes to the census, when the census taker came around. So city directories and business directories can give you both business and or residence addresses, occupations. Sometimes you can find out about other family members because they may be listed together. You can find them in a bunch of different places. On Ancestry.com, there are university collections. Public libraries have them, and especially smaller public libraries. The Internet Archive, which is archive.org, which is a phenomenal source of all kinds of out of print book and out of copyright books. And then Logan Kleinwachs has his genealogy indexer site that has directories for European and Russian cities. And then even JewishGen, I found a Polish directory, Polish city directory. It was Poland between the wars, and that it was the area that my relatives were from in what is now Belarus, that was part of Poland during the war. So the best way to find city directories is to search the city name and then historical city directories and see what you come up with, because the collections are just expanding all the time because they take up a lot of room, and there are more and more available as time goes on. Now, be aware that Ancestry has a collection, but they're not it's not always comprehensive. So, and I've found, like samples on Ancestry, and then I've gone to the public library and or just done a Google search and found an entire collection, whereas Ancestry just had a few of them. So this is a situation where Google is definitely your friend. So here's an example of a cousin of my grandmother's, whose name was Morris Panofsky, and he was listed as a tailor, and that's his home address in Newark, New Jersey. Okay, now I wanted to talk a little bit about passports and passport applications. Ancestry and Family Search have passport applications, and they contain typically a name, birth date, the spouse, year of arrival, naturalization record if they're foreign born, the date and place, and then their occupation and their photo. You may also be able to get copies of passports. There was somebody that in a naturalization record, I can't remember where I saw the reference to it, but there was reference to a passport that he had, or a passport application, and I actually had to write to it was one of the courts in New Jersey, and because I didn't have a birth record for him, so I was able to send for a passport, and I got secondary information, birth information, but it was still really helpful. I wanted to mention foreign passports. Now, the availability and format is going to vary by jurisdiction. The ones that I'm familiar with are the Lithuanian and the Latvian passports. And these are typically internal passports, but sometimes there are foreign passport applications as well. What's really good about these is that not only, okay, so first of all, okay, what's really good about the files themselves is that sometimes there's a copy of the passport itself, and that's all there is. But sometimes there are supporting materials, and I have a relative on on my father's side, who there are literally 92 frames on Family Search for his in the Latvian collection that give his old Lithuanian passport, his German passport from Riga right after World War I, his army separation papers, his Latvian passport, and then a lot of supporting information. So there's all kinds of information in this. Not all of them are 92 pages. Most of them are going to be probably 3 or 4, but this one happens to be an extraordinarily large one. So you can find out about these on Latvia SIG, and there's a Lithuanian internal passports database from 1919 to 1940. And the originals are held by the Lithuanian Central State Archives. And you can go to the Latvia SIG website to read more about this collection and how to obtain copies of them. You can either order them through Latvia SIG if the archives are open, which they haven't been during COVID, or you can order them straight from the archives directly, and the archivists are working, but the archives were not open to the public for a while, and I don't know if that's the current state. Latvia has internal passports database on the JewishGen Latvia collection. The indexing is in progress, and it includes both the passports themselves and the passport application books, which are ledgers of where the people would go, with a picture and, apply for the passports. The originals are held by the Latvian State Historical Archives. Some images are indexed on Yad Vashem, and the images have also been completely filmed by Family Search, but they're part of the unindexed collection. And there's a really good, if you read the database description on JewishGen, it gives you a lot of good information about that. There are also passports as artifacts. Somebody, I have a second cousin, who has a copy of our great-grandfather's original passport. And in a lot of cases, this may be the only photo that you have of an ancestor. So this is a copy of a personal certificate, and it says here, this translates, according to Google Translate, to instead of internal passport, that she had submitted to get a foreign passport so that she could, so this was a Lithuanian document that she submitted to Lithuania to get a foreign passport to go to Latvia, where she later got married. And she also has a Latvian passport under her married name as well. But this I got from the Lithuanian Central State Archives. And it's got, her birth information shows that, where she was born and she was Jewish, and there's a lot of other information on it, and not to mention the picture. This is just a copy of a couple of pages from my great-grandfather's Russian passport from 1909. And my second cousin had this for a long time and never bothered to have it translated. And what I found out from this, which we always thought, based on a lot of secondary information, that he was from a town called Bereza, which is, or Bereza, Kartus Bereza, which is in currently in Belarus. But this from 1909, which is a much earlier date, shows that he is from Jetlova, which is north of Slonim. It's still in the same general area, but it's a completely different town. And also shows that we never knew that his father's name was Moshe Wolf. We knew it was Moshe, but we didn't know the Wolf. So, and that is not a typo. Molchatsky is butchered in any language, it seems. But anyway, so this is his, this turned out to be really useful information that gave clues that I was able to give to a researcher in Belarus and find out a lot more information. Voter lists do not exist for all jurisdictions, but it's one of those things that you need to look and check ancestry, check other areas to see whether you can find the information. But sometimes it's the only information you can find on an ancestor, and it's helpful if you can't find census information. My grandfather sort of disappeared off the radar in Saskatchewan in 1945. And I had no idea where he lived after that. And I found there are Canadian voter lists, and I found, in fact, that after 1945, he lived in North Battleford, which is another town in Saskatchewan, which I never would have thought to look for him there. Be aware that prior to women's suffrage, only men are listed. You're going to get a name and a residence. You're going to provide, it may provide an occupation, and if in the case of, and an age, and in case of Russian records, you'll find the Russian voter list, you'll find the patronymic as well. These exist for several states. They exist nationally for Canada and for various overseas countries. So check the SIG and the Research Division databases. Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Search. IGRA has Voters Knesset Israel, a Voters Knesset Israel database. And Latvia SIG has municipal electors and rabbi electors, and the Belarus SIG has, the Belarus Research Division has the Grodno-Gubernia 1912 voters list. And this is a copy of the voters list for Molchatsky. And here we've got, let's see, this is 1912 when my great-grandfather was already here, but this is Yosel, son of Chaim from Progeny. So this is Yosef Kalman Molchatsky. So again, these can be quite useful. The last section I want to talk about just sort of miscellaneous genealogy reports, family trees, local histories, and other kinds of things. This happens to be a copy of a book called Trails and Tales of Settlement about the Lipton, Saskatchewan settlement in farm settlement in Saskatchewan, where the same Joseph Molchatsky for a while was the Rabbi Shochet and Moyle for the Jewish community who lived there, the farming community who lived there. And he's not referred to by name, but he's referred, there are a few articles that are referred to where he's referred to as Reb Joseph. So that's my great-grandfather. So these are all authored works and they vary in quality. And the major question you want to ask is, what is the source of the information? Are there source citations? And even if they're not sourced, you can use this information as hints, but you need to verify. Now, be aware that, as I'm sure you are, that family trees are copied from other family trees, and there's often little or no verification and mistakes are repeated. I recently, just the other day, found a copy of a family tree that showed my second great grandfather. And I was really gratified to see, wow, it listed his middle name, it listed his father, it listed his wife. And I thought, wow, that's really great. And I looked a little closer and I saw that, first of all, it was called so-and-so's DNA tree. And so right away I thought, uh-oh, if he put this together based on DNA matches, then I don't know about this, but let's move on. So I started looking at it and I realized that his children, who include my great-grandfather, were all listed as his siblings. And at that point, it was like, why is this tree even out there? None of this information is true. So you have to be really, really careful with family trees. However, you can use online trees to assist in tracing descendants and possible living relatives. And I've found my heritage trees to be especially useful for this. Now, as I mentioned before, local histories can be used for background information, especially if you're writing a family history. You can add a lot of detail and context to your research, and they may have specific information about your, references to your family. It just depends. You can find local histories on the Internet Archive, again, archive.org, through public libraries, through historical societies, their heritage websites, local genealogy societies, and even used booksellers or on eBay. Then there's just sort of a category of other things you can find through internet searches. There are all sorts of digitized books on topics. We will talk about this name change in a second, but I found, I was looking for information about the synagogue where a relative of mine was married in Leeds, and I found there was a section on synagogues and their officers in a UK Jewish yearbook for 1907. My brother-in-law's had a relative who a woman who went to UC Berkeley before it was really common for women to go to college. And I found an early graduation program that listed her name and her major and everything. There is a report that I've referenced a lot of times. This is put out by Congress in 1911. It was a report from actually about human traffic and steerage conditions. But there's a lot of information on what it was like to come across on a ship in steerage and what the conditions were like. And it's really useful for providing, for getting into the stories of your ancestors and finding out, just sort of appreciating what they went through on their ocean voyage. And again, you can use the Internet Archive, Google Books, although be aware, and I made a note on your handout, that Google Books, sometimes you can find places on the original website where Google Books got it from, and sometimes they may be a little bit easier to access. This is an example of something that I found through a Google search, and it's a relative also from the same Minsk family. He arrived in St. John, New Brunswick, under the name of Mendel Minsk. Then he started using the name Morris Minsky. He was living in Halifax. He started using the name Morris Minsky, and he decided to change it to Morris Morrison. And this is the only relative I have who apparently changed his name legally. And this required an act of the Nova Scotia, a private act of the Nova Scotia legislature. So it says here, the name Morris Morsky of Halifax in the county of Halifax, merchant, is hereby changed to Morris Morrison. And from here and after it, the passing of this act, the said Morris Minsky shall be legally called and known by the name Morris Morrison. So you never know what you're going to find. And this also explained who this Morris Morrison was that some of my relatives were going to listed as a contact in Halifax. So this is just a sampling of some of the resources to use when the record you can't find that you need isn't found, you can't find or isn't available. Keep in mind what we talked about, the rules of sources, information, and evidence in evaluating which sources, whatever sources you choose, and be creative in trying to find new sources to enhance your research. Once you find the records, read them carefully and extract, or even by implication, whatever information you can. And never say never. The record you're searching for may eventually be discovered, like that marriage record in Davenport, Iowa, or the information you seek can turn up in another source. And now I will open this up to questions. I guess I can look at the chat. Okay, and there is a lot of chat information here.
Marion, thank you so much. So we asked people to put questions in the Q&A.
Oh, okay, I'm in the wrong thing. Okay, let me go to Q&A instead of chat. Okay. Will there ever be vital data available for Countess? Vilna has vital data. I can't tell you. I don't know that for sure. What I would suggest is to look typically on Litvak SIG website. You should be able to find what the coverage is and what vital records are available for what for what time periods. But I would go to Litvak SIG website and check that out because I don't know. As I mentioned, not all records have survived evenly for all towns. In Skuders, Lithuania, there are no vital records, period. Doesn't mean there aren't other, and there's no census record. There are no 1897 census records, but I have found other information, including internal passports. So, it just depends. When you have a name for a specific concentration camp, I would suggest trying the Arlson archives. They have a really big digitized archive, and if they were in it specifically, if they went to a death camp, I don't know, but if they were in a work camp, you might find information. Found long lost family members in the 1940 census, but now what can I do to find them where they exist? Do you want the 1950 census will be available? Then what? There's a period of time. I don't know. Let's see. That's an interesting question. I would try newspapers. Newspapers, you can find a lot of information about, and because a lot of the vital records are restricted. But I would start with newspapers, and city directories are another area. But that time period, that sort of after 1940 time period, and the 1950 to 60s is a little rough. I do not have any suggestion for records. Poland is not my wheelhouse. I don't know. I would contact JRI Poland and see what they say. Again, okay, if there are records that are not listed in, I would, for specific areas, I would try, like somebody's asking about Galicia, I would try Gesher Galicia and ask some of the administrators about specific, or some of the people who are the administrators and the people who are responsible for the records, what is and is not available. Sometimes things are available but haven't yet been translated. So so that, but the specific areas would know that. Holocaust identity question. Any records in Arlson archives for a family member who died in the Shoah? Survivor is still alive as his grandson. They believe he died in the Countess ghetto. The Arlson archives indicate he was sent to a few concentrations prior to his death. All the information matches parents' names, where born and lived, but the age is off. That's a tough one, and I don't think I can answer that. The question is, the age is 15 years off. The family thinks someone used his identity, how to handle. Just keep researching, and I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't know how how you would find that out. Just try to find out as much information as you can. And sometimes if you put it aside and come back to it later, things sort of start to fall into place. Whoever's contacting me through Jeannie, is it a valid link? I can't really comment on Jeannie. Jeannie is somewhat, some people love Jeannie and some people hate Jeannie. It's like anything else. Any family tree needs sources. And if a tree has sources, then, you know, then the information is reliable. I have people, I have worked really hard to fill in a certain part of my tree, and I see that some of my cousins have added some people way back in, you know, and this is a family from Telshai, Lithuania, and they have people who are siblings born in Poland. And I said, where did you get that information? And they said, oh, I found it on a family tree. And I said, there's no proof that that's the case. And if it's the same family, it's likely not the same person, because they're going to be from Telshai, not from this town in Poland that's however many hundreds of miles away. And they said, well, I don't want to take it off because it's going to be too hard to put off if it turns out to be the correct thing. So all I can say is just beware and try to validate. Secondhand knowledge. I've seen a lot of death certificates where the informant entered incorrect information from parents. How do you handle this? I don't know if it's possible to resubmit that information. I know even on my grandmother's death certificate, and this is my maternal grandmother, my father filled out the information on parents' names and they're dead wrong. So, you know, just try to find the information out through sources that were closer to the event. You know, when, you know, if you can find a marriage record, if you can find, you know, information that the about the if you can research the person more thoroughly other than the death record, use the death record as a starting point, but you'll have to try other kinds of records. What do you do if second marriage never actually legally happened? New husband's name was never legally done. So what happened to her grandfather is one of those children. You know, sometimes not everything had a record. We only see our ancestors' records in terms of when they made contact with the state, you know, had some contact with some kind of legal entity or with a synagogue or something like that. But we don't necessarily, some information you're not going to find if it was never recorded and never legally done. You may just never find it. Is a headstone direct evidence? It would be direct evidence of the death, but the information on the headstone, it's direct. This person died, this person was born, this is the person's name. Whether it's typically, but it's unknown as far as the information itself is unknown and you don't know who provided it. So because of that, you don't always know that it's accurate. It's certainly direct evidence of a death. Let's see. I have possible death record in breast for relation. How would I go about finding supporting info to know if that's my relation's information? For example, would ordering a copy of the real document. Okay. In general, if you see a record that's a derivative record that refers to an archival number for a record, you are always better off getting the original record, because there's always going to be, almost always, not always the case for some for box tax records and things like that, but in most cases for vital records and other things, there's usually information above and beyond what is on a record abstract or an index record. So as a matter of general good practice, it's always a good idea to get the original. I'm just going to try to take some names here. Can I email your response? Okay, yes, you can. I listed my my email address, so you can absolutely email me a question. How to locate records from Polish newspapers? That is not. I know very little about Poland. This is not my geographical area of expertise. I would contact someone from JRI Poland and see what they would suggest. Ancestry.com charges for access to articles in newspapers like obituaries. Can they be obtained free elsewhere? Free newspapers. The newspaper site I know, Chronicling America is the website that I know of for obituaries and for newspapers. Sometimes you can just Google the person's name and obituary and see what you can find. There is a website of free newspapers. I forget what it's called, but you can Google free historical newspapers and see what you can find. There are some available. There are a lot of newspapers that are available free. Google newspapers. Google does have some newspapers digitized, but they're not really very well indexed and they're difficult to find. But I would do Google free historical newspapers and you will find a listing. There is a website whose name escapes me and I don't remember what it's called. I've been searching unsuccessfully for a ship's manifest related to Dora Lippman, my grandmother, and the first oldest of many siblings to arrive in the U.S. I know her hometown. How else might? Well, okay, it's always a good idea to widen your search to collateral relatives, to any relatives who may have come over as well. I didn't know that my grandfather came to the United States. I thought he went straight to Canada and he did not. It turned out he went to New York, but I traced him through his brother. So if you have other siblings that you know who immigrated, then try to find out all you can about them. Can you discuss restrictions that a cemetery office will provide by phone? The only thing, it really depends on the jurisdiction. I know that, for instance, I called Paperman's, which is well, wait, that wasn't the cemetery office. That was actually the Paperman's is the mortuary in Montreal. They weren't really very forthcoming with information, but when I asked for the yard site, they were able to give that to me. So it's going to depend on the restrictions by state. And you may want to try if you can't find the cemetery office, you could try the funeral home. Do these websites have info on graves in Lithuania from when it was Poland? If not, any suggestions? Grave website, the only thing you can try to, there are international grave websites. I know, for instance, that Billing Graves has a lot of international sites. I don't know about, countries like Lithuania or Poland. I have no idea. I have a copy of a gravestone from Lithuania that it so happens one of my cousins had a relative in his family on his father's side who was a photographer, and they have a picture of his of his grandmother, of my father's aunt, who took a picture of the gravestone of my great grandmother, but I just happen to have that, so I don't know. But Billion Graves is good for international. If a funeral home memorial chapel closes down, what generally happens to its records? You can actually research the history of the funeral home. Sometimes they get taken over by another funeral home, and if they might have those records. Have a great uncle who died in Northern California, maybe Redwood City. Can't find a date or grave. The only thing I can suggest is to keep trying, to Google it, Redwood City, and see if you can find, what the cemeteries are there, and see if you can find them on any of the cemetery websites, and or if there's a cemetery website that is not on that's not in Find a Grave or something, then call them directly. Okay, somebody's asking from France. from the Austria-Hungarian Empire today, Austria-Romania, and also Ukraine for part of it. There are various research divisions on JewishGen there that cover the area that was formerly the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So I would look on JewishGen and see which research divisions cover that area and use that as a starting point. What is JOBR? It is the JewishGen Online Worldwide Burial Registry. Why are headstones frequently inaccurate? Aren't they usually based on info provided by the next of kin or other sources close to the deceased? I think the key to that is other sources close to the deceased. The example I showed, the sister was certainly as close to the deceased as you could get, and yet for whatever reason, she was dead wrong when it came to her sister's birth date. You know, in general, finding some, if you can find a birth record was recorded close to the birth. The death happened well after the birth. Especially if someone was born overseas, they may not have that information. So there's a lot of reasons why the headstone is inaccurate. How did I find the funeral home for Ethel Pauline? I believe it was through JOBR, through the JewishGen Online Worldwide Burial Registry. I think it was either from the cemetery, or I may have asked about the funeral home, or it was listed on JOBR, I forget. When you find a resource such as a gravestone where the information is so different from expected, how do you know it's the same person? That is going to take much more than much more than a 10-word or less answer. It just requires a lot of further research, and you find everything you can on people with that name, and then you start comparing them. I've seen where some people can take, you can do a spreadsheet and put information, you do a timeline side by side of those two specific people and see, and compare the information to see if it's the same person. Can the chat be saved? That's an Avrami question.
No, unfortunately not. We can share that. You can copy and paste it while it's open, but we can't give it out. But Marion, I think we should do maybe one more question.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot more here. I don't want to run too. Is this being recorded, by the way? I should have. Is there a good source to find out about Shanghai refugees? I've tried United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Try the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee archives. I actually found some information about a lot of communities after the war. There was one about the Kobe Jews who had escaped to Kobe, but I would try, it's the Joint Distribution Committee, JDC archives, and see if you can find information there. I'll take one more. Do I have any information on Lithuania or Belarus? I would say contact the Latvia SIG website and the Belarus Research Division. And again, another question about JOBR, which we already answered. Read the gravestone DOB error. Perhaps one should have considered the possibility of her having been a later child named in memory of her early sib who had passed. There's no evidence that that's the case, because based on people who knew her personally, that there were two sisters, and the two sisters were the same age, close to the same age. Also, there were records that showed that Pauline Ethel had traveled. There were border records that she had traveled under various names, so it was clear, and her age was given there. So that yes, that is a possibility, but there were other records that proved that it was probably not that it was the same person. Okay.
Marion, thank you very much. This was incredibly informative and interesting. The comments demonstrate how much people appreciated your talk, and thanks for spending extra time to answer all of these questions. For everybody who participated, thank you. We're so glad that you were with us. After the webinar, and within a couple of hours, hopefully, or by tomorrow at the latest, we will send a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a brief survey. We'll include the handout again as well. Next week's webinar will focus on Landsmannschaften. There will be a link in the email to register for that program as well. And Marion, we thank you again. We thank all of you for participating. And we wish you all a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Take care.
Okay, thanks for having me.